Welcome to A Case of the Mondays, a podcast by 3R Strategy where we talk about some of the most pressing issues facing HR professionals and business leaders. From fair treatment of employees to fostering transparency in the workplace, we'll explore how to create an environment where people don't just have to come to work, but want to. So, if you're feeling blue, tune in and join the conversation so you don't end up with a case of the Mondays.
Welcome to another episode of A Case of the Mondays. My name is Ramesh Kaleem, your podcast host, and today we're discussing the power of purpose in the workplace, particularly for Gen Z employees. Our guest speaker today is Ali Khan, who is the CEO of Shape Global, the employee experience measurement company. Previously, Ali was the CTO and Chief Science Innovation Officer and now Scientific Advisor to AXA. He also worked in blood diagnostics, which I'm not sure I completely understand what that means, but Ali, you can
I like
probably
the way
explain
you
that for
said
us.
blood. You really emphasize that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not pay or reward diagnostics, it's blood diagnostics, which I'm sure is a lot more complicated. Welcome to the podcast.
It's really good to be here. Thanks, Ramesh. It's been a long time coming as well.
Yes, it has. I think we first got in touch maybe 2 years ago now. I think when you saw my pay transparency video.
I did. I saw your pay transparency video and I thought, he looks like a really approachable guy. I should get in touch. And I think it was COVID, so I was feeling particularly brave, during that period. And so, yeah, we got in touch and I think we struck a chord with each other. So that was fantastic. And we've always been thinking about doing something like this. So, yeah, you beat me to it.
Yeah. So no, I'm really glad to have you on this, and this is a topic that I've been interested in for a long time. The power purpose in the workplace. Probably since I've first heard the Simon Sinek talk on TED Talk on starting with why, and I mean something that obviously when I first set up 3R Strategy, it was something I really wanted to get down is why are we doing this, and our why has always been. I know it's become very fashionable now. Everyone's talking about pay transparency, but that was always our why is around pay transparency and fair and equitable approach to pay. But what I'm really interested in is hearing. Actually, before we go into this, can you tell us a bit about your background? What exactly did you do in blood diagnostics, and what led to you coming up with the idea for Shape?
Okay. So I worked in telecoms and we were trying to figure out back in those days, how do you move from voice-centric networks to data-centric networks? And doing that, we came across this whole concept called machine-to-machine or IoT. And so this is the ability for disparate small to very large devices, everything from glucose meters and a medical device all the way through to fridges, to connect it to the internet and having a conversation with supply chain systems or something needs replenishing and so forth. Now, in this glucose meter, a couple of old colleagues of mine and I, we got together and we quite frankly butchered a device. And we took out the battery, we put in a new modem, enhanced the battery, and it was talking to the cellular network. And so one day I'm actually showing this to a series of people at an event, and it was the number of, let's say, 4.6 millimoles per litre or 5.2 millimoles per litre. If you show that to a person, they don't really understand what that means. And if they do understand what it means, what do you do next? So this is moving from data to insight to foresight. And so we demonstrated that we could tell people what the number meant in a more meaningful way, and therefore what the next action that they should be taking. That caught the attention of the guys that worked for the person that created the glucometer. In fact, that device, that was a Johnson & Johnson LifeScan device. And it just so happened I'd stumbled upon presenting this to the people that worked for the chap. So they said, come and talk to us. So before I knew it, they'd asked me to come in and said, "Can you decode all of these metrics?" And that's when I found out they were the world's largest rapid diagnostics manufacturer. Everything from effectively looking at your HIV status, your hepatitis C, any bloodborne pathogen type of products and diagnostics around chronic diseases as well. But effectively, what they did was they took their reading from blood. And what's wonderful about blood is blood doesn't lie. Right. So once you start to trend line that, that makes a lot more sense to people. And then very quickly that got me into understanding how to help people in their health, looking at it from a data centric and now a biology centric perspective. Then I moved into design. How do you use design effectively as well?
So can I check? So when you talk about this blood diagnostics, is it basically looking at the data to see where somebody is now to try and predict, for example, a disease they might develop in the future? Is
Oh,
that
precisely, absolutely. Or it's about how well do they manage that disease today?
and tell me if this is an accurate or inaccurate summary, is what you've done now is you've replaced the data for blood and health with data from employees to provide a diagnostic of the employee experience and a prediction of what's going to happen in the future. Is
That's a really good way of articulating it. That the evolution of the learning was to move from using the same types of methodologies and statistical analysis and rigor from a clinical sciences perspective. We applied that same clinical rigor to the way that we study employee experience. So even though we're not clinical in our output and we don't look at risk effectively from that perspective, we do understand the impact it has on an employee's experience at work and also their ability to have a very fulfilling, holistic, well-being led experience. And in addition to that, we look at it from a perspective of productivity and performance as well. So all of these concepts come together. But the difference is compared to pretty much everybody in the market, we come at it from blood type of analysis, and that helps us get to a higher degree of accuracy.
okay. I find this fascinating because I'm a data person, and you know, I'm always looking at how we can use data to come up with answers and predict things. So this is what you're now doing on the employee side, and I guess we'll look at the data at in a bit. But this concept of purpose in the workplace. Now, I always, like I said, I got this from Simon Sinek, starting with why. So for me, purpose has always been around why are we doing something? If we have an organization, our purpose is why do we exist? So what is your definition of purpose, and why do you think this is becoming increasingly important for employees?
Yeah, look, thanks. Ramesh, I have the privilege of speaking to quite a few leaders, large businesses, medium, small time, small startups as well. And more recently, I met with a chap called Jeff Dewing, who is the CEO of a company called Cloud FM, and I really liked his definition. And it's not actually the classic definition of purpose, but I think it leads to that. He said most people just want to come to work to contribute to something bigger than themselves. And that to me really struck a chord with me personally, that you can look up the dictionary definition of purpose, that it's about connectedness. It's all these other factors underneath that we measure within Shape, and it's about belief, and it's about making sure that you have this visceral, deep understanding and shared value as well. So there's many other ways of looking at decoding purpose. But the one I really like is that what people can really come to work to do. And if we can provide as employers a safe space for them to be able to practice that contribution and to help them be fulfilled within themselves, that I think is a really nice way of looking at purpose for me.
Okay. And how does that relate to the concept of flourishing?
Yeah, it means we found that when you were going to articulate how people are doing, a really good way of doing that accurately is using a scoring system. So we did. So we put a scoring system together, and we can tell you whether you are low in your score, medium, or high. But what we found was that really missed the mark. That deeper emotional connection with the numbers wasn't quite there. And so, good design practice that I've been practicing for many years, what it tells us is label the number, give it a range, and tell people where they're really at from that incredibly powerful label. So, we instituted a different framework in the scoring. We studied this for about 11 months, actually. It took us to figure this out because we really needed, again, that clinical kind of rigor approach to what we're doing. And so, people are struggling, they are striving, or flourishing. And so flourishing is what we found right across the board, or whatever question we tend to ask on whatever we are measuring, therefore, ultimately we want people to get appreciated up in their score so they are flourishing. And what we found is that that state of flourishing is also what businesses as employers want their employees to be experiencing. Why? Because that means they're getting the support they need. They've got great ENPS scores. As managers, they're supporting their staff. That means they're happy in their hybrid balance. All of these things that we practically think about at work, we want to be in a state where we can be in the heightened possible state of flourishing. So we're now starting to decode these type of things. Now, if you look at purpose connected into that, if people don't feel connected, they don't have that belief, that trust, that honesty with the business, they're not going to have a deeper rooted connection to the purpose. Their purposeful connection with the business is struggling. So that's why it's important to actually have these measures in place that allow us to build a better understanding of what does it take for a person to get to purpose or having great purpose, and how do you get them to keep on climbing up there.
Okay, so if you have these three levels of struggling, striving, and flourishing, and let's say you have an organization that at least the leadership feels that they have a real sense of purpose, and they feel like the employees do as well. But what you're saying is that that might be the case from the organization or the leadership team, but some of the employees will still be struggling, some might be striving, and others will be flourishing. So can you still have the different levels of within that organization, even though that sense of purpose exists? And if so, what is the deciding factor, or what distinguishes somebody struggling in that environment versus somebody who is flourishing?
Okay, so this is what we call the democratization of the data. So it allows you to look at all the angles without the biases. So I'll give you an example. Typically in survey systems, what happens is corporates will ask their employees to complete the survey, only for that survey data then to be taken and passed on to the management team. So the management team can then put their own bias on it, quite frankly, right? And it's not necessarily a deliberate bias. It's more a case of this is how they prefer to read the data. The preference comes in. They can't help it. It's human nature. On the other side of the fence, there's a whole bunch of surveys out there, and what they do is they'll just go to the executive team. They'll say, we're just going to ask them. Some of the big consultancy firms do that. Now, recently, what we did was we looked at a lot of our data, and we put it into a banded approach. So we looked at the people at the very top of the tree that reported directly up into the CEO or the managing director, and we looked at people who reported into that band above, and so that became band 2, band 3, band 4. And so you can get up to 7 to 8 bands, and sometimes in very, very large, complex organizations, it gets even bigger. And we asked them all the same questions. And guess what we found? We found that the people at the top did have a bias, that they were experiencing a lot more support, a lot more resources, and they had a great trust and probably a great purpose as well, right? However, what we found was downstream, you can start to see that starts to fall away. It erodes. But an interesting thing we also found in some organizations was it was a little bit like a humped curve, right? Effectively, where you found that the executive teams were doing pretty good, but what really made it worse was when that concave effect came in, where managers were feeling a lot more of the pain. And that's where we found out they were sandwiched in the middle. They were taking a lot more of pain from the staff in the lower bands, whilst also reporting back up to the higher bands. So they were really squeezed with their experience at work. So you do find that there is this data set that starts telling a really powerful story of what's really going on in business in a snapshot. And within that, you can start to see purpose starts to erode, especially when every single day, all you're doing is dealing with the day-to-day issues. You don't get that opportunity, to really get your head above and start to build that belief again.
So, in that example of the leadership team striving or flourishing, and the employees striving or flourishing, but the management is struggling, are there any common themes that you've seen on why is it the management is struggling while the rest of the employees seem to be doing okay?
Do you know what's interesting is the causal factors. We don't really get into the finer detail on that because there could be 100 of different reasons of why that's happening. But we can have the data set does point us towards some pretty obvious things that might be going on. For example, if there are communication issues inside the business, you can start to see that toxicity is hovering around certain bands. You can actually see that in the data set as well. And you can also see that there's a disparity in terms of the way in which management style is perceived and experienced as well. So we're collecting about 100 plus data points per person in about 25-minute survey. So it's a lot. It's a very high velocity, very accurate as well. And as we start to look into the detail, you can start to see, broadly speaking, the culture's not necessarily in the right place. The culture could be impacting the psychological health of people as well. So all of these things start to play a role in people struggling in the business.
Okay. Now, one of the things you tend to see, not everyone, but some people talking about, I've seen posts about this on LinkedIn, for example, people getting annoyed because you say, well, Gen Z is like this and Gen Y is like this. And they say, oh, but don't generalize, don't say because everyone's different, which is true. But then again, as data people, we see that there are certain trends that exist in different populations, and we can either treat everyone exactly the same and pretend that there are no common themes, or we can try and personalize as much as possible based on certain employee populations. So what are you seeing? Because one of the things that I came across a while ago was how Gen Z is really valuing a sense of purpose in the workplace. And obviously we look at pay, and we found that I found this research where it talked about Gen Z is the first generation that is actually willing to sacrifice pay to work in a place where they find a real sense of purpose. So they're valuing purpose over pay as the first generation. So what have you found in your data and your research around Gen Z employees and purpose in the workplace?
I'm glad you asked because we actually pulled some data for you for the show. So I want to articulate it from two different perspectives. If I can just jump over to the screen here. So we looked at the areas that the Gen Z group or the Gen Z group was struggling in their top number of factors, and there's a pattern that does emerge. And then we looked at it in comparison to everybody else, so everybody outside of Gen Z. So this is where you've got your Gen Y, your Gen X. And what we found was, if we just look at, generally speaking, the insights tell us that younger people, they don't have great nutrition. So if we follow this down whilst I read this, you can start to build up a visualization in your mind of the kind of it create an emotional connection with the people in your organization. This is potentially what they could be struggling with as well. So they haven't got the best of nutrition. They don't get enough sleep, so adequate sleep is not there. they're feeling tired, not great with their concentration. So they do suffer from physical and or mental health issues as a result of stress. And your favorite, they don't feel they get paid enough. So they don't feel they've got competitive salaries in their business. We ask a question about them having access to training and development opportunities. They don't feel that they do have those professional development opportunities as much. And then one of your other ones, adequate reward. They don't feel they're adequately rewarded. Now, I must point out in a lot of our data set, salary, so pay and reward, they do tend to trend lower. And we've even found that against higher paying sectors where people are actually being paid in the top quartile, they still think that they're actually being overworked and probably not being compensated enough. So that's a general trend that we see. So we can't really take too much from that alone. But what I always say is this is perception over reality, because you're working back from your teams feeling that way. And if they believe they're not adequately rewarded, still needs to be addressed. Younger people also don't get enough or adequate exercise. So they don't do enough of the moderate to vigorous physical activity per week. They don't feel they've got effective coping strategies. And interestingly, they're not really managing commuting really well either. So there's something to be dug into that one. And then job security, they don't particularly feel they've got that too. Okay, so now let me jump to where the comparisons are. And what we see is roughly a 10% difference in scores between the two different groups. So interestingly, coping strategies. Older people will tend to have better coping strategies than younger people. And this is actually something that's quite consistent in what we've seen with the data that we've studied for mental health across the world inside of AXA as well. We've all and that's 5.4 million data points, so it's about as strong as you can possibly make it. You can take it to the bank. In fact, we've got global NGO using that data for developing government public policy now as well. Commuting comes in here. So older people tend to manage the commute much better than younger people. And I think that's also something, there's got to be something here about COVID. We have to perhaps dig deeper in that. Interestingly, there's something here about temperature. So younger people are struggling more with ambient temperature in an office environment as opposed to younger people. And then we've got also feeling equipped for the job. So do they feel they've got the right equipment for completing and being proficient in their job? Overall office quality, they're struggling with a little bit more. Do they find their role sufficiently challenging? We've got some lower scores in there. And then we've also got this gap in terms of older and younger generations feeling that they've got a good fit between their skills and the demands of the job. So there's a gap there that needs to be closed as well. They don't feel they've got committed colleagues around them, so the co-workers don't feel as committed to the success of the organisation from their perspective. And then we've got general caring, elder care, child care at home, so they don't feel that's really as manageable. And then they're back into the work environment as well, so they don't feel like the decor is really up to their standard. And that's actually quite a powerful culture one that's overlooked by a lot of organisations in measure. So I've actually just gone through 10 where they are generally feeling they're struggling, and then I've gone and produced 10 examples there of where there's roughly a 10% difference between older groups and younger groups in the organisation, and what that comparator approach looks like.
Okay, so some of these factors where you said that they're struggling with, actually everyone is struggling with, right? Is that what you're saying?
There's a level of struggling across the board, but
yeah,
the older groups seem to be faring better in their struggling, so that means there'll be more people striving and flourishing in the older groups as opposed to the younger groups with these particular things.
Okay, so things like the lack of sleep and the commute, which I think is interesting because if you look at things like remote working, I can't remember if I've seen this research, or have you seen any research around Gen Z preferring remote working more than other generations. Maybe that's linked to the lack of sleep and struggling with commute. But is that in the research that you've seen?
Yeah, Nick Bloom from Stanford does a lot of work around this, and he collects a lot of study metrics from around the world. And Stanford, so it's pretty high quality stuff. And they have found that in their data. I can't quote one particular study off the top of my head right now, but what I can say is this trend line that you see there, younger people do prefer not to work from the office. They do prefer to work in a much more hybrid way. However, it kind of goes in roundabouts. I've also seen data points where younger people want to get right back into the office. But one thing's true, nobody likes to be told to get back into the office and do 3 days there because it's good for their health, as told by the leadership without any demonstrated evidence. That's going nowhere. And in fact, if anything, that's just creating animosity, and you don't need to be Gen X, Y, or Z to not like that.
Yeah, definitely. So going back to your previous point of that sense of purpose and struggling, striving, flourishing, have you seen any good examples from organizations where they have seen employees that are struggling with finding that real sense of purpose in the workplace, and what sort of strategies have they used to try and really create that sense of purpose for their employees?
You know, Mies, I'll tell you a really interesting. I have these experiences where we bring the data to life and tell people about this emotional connection that they should be having with the data, and we try to bring it to life where we will actually narrate the data in a way. We'll say, "This is Jessica," for example. We're going to now walk you through Jessica's life through the data.
Isn't that what the politicians do as well? They create a character and then they start.
Personas are a fantastic way to get people really.
Yeah, exactly. It's a powerful way to connect to a topic.
And you do find they get connected. It absolutely works. And I remember this one managing director, large business, but we did a pocket of people in her part of the organization where we ran the survey. She got the results and she said, can you talk me through a little bit about these results? And what we did is we performed this additional set of results, which was the banding analysis. And we found this really, really interesting set of data where it was the hygiene factors in the business. And there was specifically in the IT area of the business where the managers were saying that the IT system sucked. Right. And normally what you see is the people in charge of the functions tend to, give a pat on the back for each other and they're going, "This is great and we're doing quite good." Except in this one, it was upside down. Normally what you see, like I said, is manager teams scoring themselves highly, and then in a certain function and below, people aren't experiencing it really well, so they score them really, really well. And I'm yet to meet any organization where IT is really, celebrated.
Yeah.
And this data was really disturbing. The people at the top thought the IT systems were not good. People below, as they went on, they thought it was they thought it was fine. And so this managing director came to me. She says, "Can you explain this to me?" And as we're talking this through, she said these words to me. She said, "Are you telling me basically that the people at the top know what they're doing is not good enough, yet the people below have basically accepted mediocrity in my business?" And then here's what she really killed herself on, right? And you could see it was burning her inside. And she says, "To think I pay all these effing people 1/3 of the total salary." And she goes, "This is where we've ended up." She was so deeply connected. She was really, really upset. She was almost tearful. She changed her strategy on the back of that data.
Okay, that's interesting.
There's the purpose of your IT system, right? Being brought into question.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it's you don't really see many organizations where people feel really passionate about the IT systems unless things are really going wrong. Whereas, and I wonder if that's to do with, again, lack of communication, because at the top, the leadership might realize that actually they're, based on what they were looking to achieve, they haven't achieved what they were supposed to with the IT systems, where other people are just thinking, well, my laptop's working, so I don't see the problem.
Ramesh, you're not wrong. In larger corporate systems, they have something, called the virtual desks or the VDIs. And on average, it can take people anywhere between 3 to 7 minutes to log in. You multiply that by 1,000 people, that's a lot of minutes per day. It's a lot of hours per year, per month, and so forth. And so we have an algorithm, actually, interestingly, not for this particular purpose, although that would be quite fun to work out how much IT systems are eroding productivity, literally producing in those minutes that you can't do something is not even arguably, something that you can debate. It's just a black and white. But we do actually have an algorithm that looks at the work time loss equivalent. So, we saw an example in there, temperature. Younger people seem to be struggling with temperature more. So here's an interesting one. It's tiny. It's just a number. It's just temperature. It can't possibly be that. It can't be that impactful. Let me tell you a story. So a couple of weeks ago, I was out in Holland doing a presentation. We had a round table and we had to provide a perspective to real estate and facilities management leaders in terms of what information they are in charge of, making sure that is an experience they can deliver. So 21.4 degrees or there or thereabouts, they're happy. I'm going home, done my job, I've done great. So what we do is we look at it from the perspective of the people experiencing that temperature. So we ask them, and they tell us across the board, this is, I think, a study of 311 people in one building, out of which about 200, I think it was 5 people, if I haven't got it wrong. It feels so fresh in my mind having presented it. So 200 odd people said, in fact, 30% to 29.7% of them said they were struggling. Now, convert that struggling into work time loss. That's an average of 3 days per person per year. Now, you do enough of this, guess what happens to the purpose? It starts eroding their belief, their connectedness, that connection to deliver, that contribution they can make. That will start to fall away.
Okay, so I've got 2 questions. So the first one, how do you work out the loss of time? So when you say, oh, that's 2 days or that's 3 days, how do you work that out?
It's a very special algorithm behind that took us 2 years to build.
Yeah.
So there's some scientific jiggery-pokery behind that. But essentially, at the largest scale, what we do is we actually look at Office of National Statistics data. So we go right back to the core government database. We look at, in that particular industry that client happens to be in that industry, what are the best and worst performing sectors, or rather companies in that space. So we don't have company names, but what we do have is we've got size of company, we've got what kind of absenteeism they were experiencing, what retention level loss did they experience, and so forth. So turnover and so forth. And you can even now look at claims data because the government collects that. So in most countries around the world, we have access to these databases. We then take that and turn it into a scaled solution. So you end up with a scoring system and you can plot where that organization sits. Based on the best and the worst and where that client happens to be, we can now tell them how far they are off the best and how far they're off the worst. And therefore we can come back to, you look like a company that on average is losing this much time for these much activities. So we've mapped all of that back to every single question in the system.
Okay. And so my second question is like a mix of a question and a comment, where you're saying that all of these things, like the temperature, is having an impact. So are you saying that whether people feel a connection to their sense of purpose in the workplace could be down to something simple as the IT systems not working or the lighting not being done in a good way? Because when you said earlier around the Gen Z employees are struggling more with the office environment or the decor or whatever, then if that's a negative factor, then is that what's impacting their sense of purpose in the workplace as well?
It sounds like these are very, very trivial points, but they add up. So Ramiz, divorce. What they talk about
Yeah.
is, remember they say burnt toast, right?
Hmm.
It's not the burnt toast that killed the marriage. It was the accumulation of all the thousand things before it that was the last. There was the camel, or the straw that broke that broke the back of the camel. And that's what these things do. They just pitch and erode all the experiential factors to a point where we now know from studies females prefer a slightly higher temperature, and if it's slightly lower, they will struggle. We know this because of COVID. I literally met people over Zoom and video calls where they were saying they were literally wearing coats in the house and they were saying we can't afford the heating, but we are forced to work from home, so we're just going to do the best we can. I had a woman, I was interviewing once, and she had gloves on. She was trying to type, and she said, "I don't take my gloves off because it's dry." So these tiny little things that we think are trivial, they're actually adding up, and eventually, what that does is like toxicity. One person comes in to a team of 5 people, and they bring all that negativity in. Well done, you've just now affected 5 people. You've affected their mood. You keep on doing that day after day after day, those tiny little, it's just like a water drop. That drop goes over time, it literally leaves a concave kind of space over there where it erodes that tile.
Wow. I think that's really interesting, right? Because we're saying something as, like you said, as trivial as the lighting or the IT systems, all of this is impacting our culture, our sense of purpose in the workplace. Because, I always think of the example where we, as an HR team or a recruitment team, we try and fill a vacancy and say, we're going to bring somebody in, we have to pay whatever we have to. And we don't worry about the impact or the inequity that's creating, but we have to bring this person in. And that's leading to such a long-term issue and resentment and bad culture, because we know, again, particularly Gen Z employees are more than ever talking about pay in the workplace. As much as we say don't discuss pay or we put confidentiality clauses in contracts, there are some people that are going to talk about pay. So if simple things like lighting and IT systems is having an impact on culture, and how can you imagine the impact of making unfair decisions about pay, which is probably the biggest factor that people consider when they're joining an organization?
Well, it is there. People do feel that that's a problem. It was there in the top 10. Both, your 3 Rs, two of them appear in the top 10. So you're spot on, Ramiz. They're not trivial things, right? But when the good news here is, some of these things are really, really easy to fix, right? Some are really difficult. Like throughout the data set, everywhere we go, what we see, every company in the top 5 things, I would say, I would even hazard a guess at the top 3 from the latest data set, nutrition seems to be consistently a problem. Nutrition's nearly always a problem. And so we're working with, some pretty smart, clever nutrition-based companies that are innovators in this space. And they're really trying to figure out what's the role that an employer plays in contributing towards getting good nutrition practices as well. And one of the things that we've done inside the survey as well is we've tried to help everybody understand from their perspective what they can do. And their perspective is not just as an employee, but also as the manager and also as the executive, the employer of the entire organization. Everybody's got a role to play. So I like the fact that you're building out this really, really powerful and really simple framework of be brave, be transparent, let everybody know. And we try to do the same thing, that the best companies in the world are the ones that are transparent. They've got graded systems. It might be super confidential about what you're actually getting paid, but at least if you know you're in a range, at least there's a
Yeah.
step forward towards, building that transparency framework as well. So I think it's a stepped process that we've got to help organizations understand that it's in their best interest and their employee productivity will increase.
Yeah, and I know you're saying that, some of these things are easy to fix, and I think in theory it is, but if you've worked in an office, there are days when people will say, oh, I'm really cold in the morning, and in the afternoon, oh, I'm really hot. And some people are hot, some people are cold. So I know again, it might seem like I'm picking a trivial example, but it's only because you're saying this is something that can impact culture and purpose. But just trying to pick one very specific thing. How do you deal with something like that when you have so many employees? Everyone is different. Some people feel cold, others feel hot. So how do you then manage something like this, where isn't it inevitable that you're going to have a loss of time for some employees because you can't please everyone?
No, it doesn't have to be that way. You don't have to lose staff, over the fact. There's got to be enough strength in that core purpose that wants to keep them there, wants to help them contribute, and that's about the cult. There are elements of culture that are really important that will overpower. So why do people still stay in places despite? I've not yet met a person who said I'm leaving that place because it's always damn cold in there, right? So despite the fact that this is what people are feeling.
One of the things that you talk about, and I've seen you talk about, and I think you have looked at a lot of research in this area, is the link between well-being and performance. And the idea that ultimately, if you look after the well-being of employees and they feel productive, and if they feel productive, they're going to perform well. And if they perform well, the organization performs well. So essentially an organizational strategy of well-being, which is not around just that, it's a nice thing to do, looking after well-being, but actually it's a business strategy of look after well-being, because ultimately that's going to result in good business results.
So first of all, I want to help us define well-being. Being the CTO and then the scientific officer for a well-being large player in the world, one of the things that struck me was that there was a very slim definition of well-being from a health-centric perspective. So we looked at it from the perspective of psychological health and physical health. Largely physical health first, but then we've evolved to include a deeper definition and a wider, broader definition also of psychological health. So that's there. And actually, where Shape started from was we posited this really simple hypothesis that two things. Number one, health and well-being of individuals is synonymous with the health and well-being of a business, although the health and well-being of a business have different KPIs, profitability, revenue growth, etc., etc. So we wanted to look at what we call these leading metrics and the lagging metrics and see the relationship between the two. But what we found was that health and well-being was far too slim. We needed to look broader. So that became the study. What are we missing? And that's where the statistical science came into play. What would we need to measure, and what factors would we need to include within that measure in order to truly understand total well-being? And so total well-being is that experiential factor that you go into from a culture, engagement, satisfaction, commitment, work environments, your factors outside of work, your co-worker dynamic. All of these factors play a role. So we say that this is now total employee well-being. So employee well-being is no more about just purely looking at it from a perspective of employee assistance programs or occupational health. It is looking at purpose. It is looking at connectedness. It is looking at these bigger constructs. So that's the first thing. That's how I look at well-being. So now when Shape looks at it, we do find that there is a clear correlation. That's what the hypothesis has proven, that if you get great well-being totally, and all of these measures in your Shape report are leading to a place of flourishing, that means your business will flourish as well.
And do you know of an organization that has done this well?
There's a couple of good organisations. We've had the privilege of working with quite a few different organisations now over the last couple of years, and we've got now a handful of companies in different countries, and we're now trying to dig down into what's that climb? How do you get to that faster state of flourishing? What actions can you take that will get there? So when I'm thinking about what the real question of what you're saying is, I'm thinking about that accumulative approach that gets you from a struggling state to flourishing. That's what's more meaningful. Generally speaking, what you find is that no single company is doing everything really, really well. Their culture might be fantastic, but they've got great flexibility to support that. But other organizations aren't even getting that right. And when you look at now return to the office and you look at how organizations are mandating that, I'm hungry to look for the data that says, is that really working? You got them back into the office. Did it work? Have they become happier? Have they become more productive? Has it had a net positive effect on the people around them? That's more valuable, and that data is not really quite there yet. So we're trying to get that together.
Because I remember during COVID, we were starting to see articles and research of people are more productive or just as productive working at home or remotely. Whereas now that organizations are looking to get people back, we're starting to hear about, oh, research says that people are not productive at home and they're more productive in the office. So have you found any of that in your data around productivity of working in an office versus remote working?
We have. We have, absolutely. In fact, we've got some new statistics that are being prepared for release to the world around the erosion of productivity and flourishing if you don't get certain things right. When it comes to simple things of what experience looks like in the office and the home, you find there is a standard kind of benefit that you have where people feel much more in control of their environment, they feel more in control of their schedule, and so forth. So those things seem to work out better. What we're now trying to do is dig into the data and look at where are the eroding factors. What are the factors that erode flourishing much more? For example, isolation. Some people don't actually like working in complete isolation. They really struggle with that. And some people actually don't really know how to make the decisions independently. So we call this autonomy. So we've got a model called autonomy in isolation. And if you don't have the balance there in terms of higher autonomy, a high independent decision-making capability, and being able to work from home, that's a recipe for disaster. Those people require a different type of intervention. So everybody's going to require some level of support, but they require independent support. That's and precision support. That's the key thing.
There will be some HR people listening, some managers listening, and if you were to give them advice on what they can do to try and provide their employees with or how they can connect their teams to the larger sense of purpose of their organization, what advice or tips would you give?
Well, first things first, doesn't have to be ours genuinely, but run a survey where you're actually rewarding employees immediately upon them pressing submit to the answers with what their results look like. I hear it time and time again. We don't do that because we've got an anonymity in play. And I'm saying no, you've got it the wrong way around. We're talking about a single person giving input to a system and the system giving them singularly back confidential results for themselves. That's not anonymity. That's actually the purest way of actually avoiding anonymity issues, guys.
Yeah.
Right? So that's one. And second thing is connecting that through a comparative approach of how am I doing in comparison to the team and the company at large. What we find is a lot of systems out there will actually benchmark the business and performance against however many companies might be in that industry within that organization survey. That's an obsession that you need to get over.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you an example of where, because we always talk about pay, and organizations will say, well, everyone thinks pay is we're underpaid. What's the score for the rest of the sector? And they want to compare themselves to the rest of the sector. So how do you? What's your response to that?
If you're comparing not just a different fruit, but a completely different type of farming methodology that arrived at delivering that particular fruit, yet that fruit is completely different to yours. You're actually competing with unfair circumstances. They might have an advantage with new technology, new capability. So are you going to go and dig deeper into that and make the investment right at that level? What I find is what we call superficial comparisons. So usually it's a case of, well, we've got to go put a business case to the board. We've got to help them understand that our competitors are doing something. And the first thing I say to them, how do you know it's your competitor? Because which foolish organization is going to break GDPR and tell you that they've just done this on your competitor? Because that's nonsense. But what you're really looking for is a fair comparison. And the fairer comparison is look intra. But the broader comparison is what the example I gave before about, and we call this the value of benefit, is to look at the Office of National Statistics data. That is government pure data. In America, we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics and so forth for different countries. So that gives you a much deeper, broader view and a fairer view of where are you at within the industry overall when it comes to things like retention and it comes to things like absenteeism. That's where you should be focusing.
So I just wanted to go back to your first point, which is one of the things I really liked about Shape is, as an employee, the biggest frustration is when you do an employee surveys, you don't hear anything back for 2 to 3 months. And then eventually you get you attend a team meeting where your manager will finally get to share some of the results for the department. And I think that view of instantly seeing where you are in terms of all of these issues is really powerful. And I think in some ways employee surveys can have a negative impact on employees, because you do a survey and then you're thinking for the next 2 months, well, why did you ask me for my opinion if you're not doing anything about this? Or if you have, or if you're never going to do anything about this. So again, I guess we're talking a lot about data today. Have you had any experience, or have you seen anywhere where you've seen a very negative impact of employee surveys, where people are doing surveys, not seeing anything back, not hearing anything, and it's led to resentment and a bad culture?
Surveys in themselves are actually pretty poor on by and large. I mean, we do this for a living. We help, some of the world's biggest companies actually design scientifically backed surveys that are super accurate. And in all honesty, there are organizations out there who have come in, they've allowed companies to design by committee. They feel that this is the right question. Companies just need to look up something called Cronbach's Alpha, or they need to look at factor analysis. They need to look at, is that particular determined question giving you a determination to the prediction that you're actually giving back? And if you take an action to improve it, will it actually genuinely move the needle? And 9 times out of 10, unfortunately, it's not. And so we're helping organizations understand the poor surveys in themselves. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, yes, of course, if you give, you wouldn't give your customers nothing in return for filling out any level of kind of feedback.
Yeah, their time.
So why would you do that to your employees? And the opportunity for behavior change is to do it there in the moment. That's when it's fresh in their mind. So people don't have survey fatigue. What they've got is fatigue with no answers. They've got fatigue with having to wait, and then they're also fatigued with the biased interpretation of that data from the management team saying this score's great and it's a midpoint score of 45, and they're going, that's fine. Well, in Shape, we've worked hard to actually give an honest, transparent answer to the organisation, so they can actually share that with the teams, and they can help them understand what they're going to do about it as well. And that's what good looks like, and that's what the best companies in the world do.
I've got a last question before we. I'm sure we could keep discussing this for hours, but the question I wanted to ask you is around. And this relates to a sense of purpose in the workplace, because something we're hearing about increasingly is the concept of ESG, environment, social governance, and how, this is I guess in a way linking to organizational purpose is that it's not just about making a profit, it's about looking at our corporate social responsibility and governance, things like diversity, inclusion, all of these things go in there. So is this something that you are bringing into the sort of questions you ask? Because again, I think I might have seen data around this where Gen Z, because they really want that sense of purpose, ESG is a quite an important thing for them as well. So how does that link to overall organizational purpose, and do you have any data in this area?
Yeah, look, very interesting. I think you're right in that there are general studies now, and we haven't dug into our data into that degree just yet because we're actually performing a study right now around the S of ESG, and we've used the World Economic Forum's definition of ESG to arrive at the 6 key areas, including diversity and inclusion, by the way, around the social impact factor. And then what we've done is we've effectively, a business, when they've invested in this, they've actually created a treasure chest. That data is what we call low velocity, in the sense that it's going to not change culture. Even 3 people in a business cannot change the culture very quickly. They can institute a lot of change, but the culture won't change very quickly. So it takes time. Apart from mental health, a lot of the data that we've got, in nearly all the data, in fact, is good for actually looking at quarter by quarter by quarter, if not half a year at a time. So it's an annual survey is the most important piece here. And we can then break it down into which demographic groups, which buildings or sites or offices or departments. And the more you can break down into demographics, that allows you to offer them additional kind of support that they need as an intervention specifically to support them. So that's always done with the purpose of leading to action. Gen Z require more support, particularly around skills. And when we look at the data from AXA, what we found was when we look at things like EQ, self-awareness, self-acceptedness, all of these factors, they are things that you are better going to acquire skills towards when you're in proximity of people. And older generations, like me, we have a responsibility to also play our part in actually giving those skills, or giving the kind of experience that somebody could have to pick those skills up through the work itself. So it's no good just training them and doing it like a cybersecurity training. This is about practicing it. And that's where I think the role of the office starts to really come into play as well.
No, that's interesting. I think it's a good way for us to finish on this topic. Thanks a lot, Ali, for joining this podcast.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for listening. And we will see you again on another episode of Case to Mondays.